You know what's bullshit?
Steins Gate 0 episode 18. This was the single worst episode of any anime I've ever seen. No, seriously, I spent the past 4 days trying to think of a single episode of any anime that's worse than this, and any examples I was able to think of were from shows that were garbage to begin with, like ReZero and Guilty Crown. The best comparison I can make is to the first trial of Danganronpa V3, which was one of the worst games I've ever had the displeasure of playing in my entire life. Without spoilers, the first trial of V3 forces in a major twist for sheer shock value, even though said twist makes zero sense in terms of the narrative. Episode 18 basically does the same thing, but 10 times worse, and along with a half a dozen other mistakes, which make the episode so horrible, I decided to just drop the show. First, let me address the major complaint that most people are talking about, the animation. According to the steaming pile of elitist garbage known as the Steins Gate subreddit, and if you don't believe me that's elitist garbage, take a look at the comments of my theory video from a few weeks back. All I did is post a theory video and just look at the comments on that thing. Anyways, according to that steaming pile of garbage, there were many points in the episode where the animation quality dipped drastically. Now, I say according to them because I didn't notice this myself, and frankly, I don't care. Your animation could literally be on par with Mass Effect Andromeda, and I wouldn't care, since what I primarily care about is the story. In fact, I actually don't even mind the animation 90% of the time in Andromeda, because the reason I call Andromeda the worst game I've ever played, it's worse than Danganronpa V3, V3 is a close second though, is because it has the worst story I've ever seen in a video game. Basically, the reason I despise this episode has nothing to do with the animation quality and all to do with the story. So with that in mind, what's wrong with the story? The primary issue with the story is that the series hyped up Steins Gate 0 to be the darkest world line, since this world line leads to the end of the world. However, up until episode 18, we haven't seen anything dark enough to justify this claim. They've been hyping this up since episode 2 of the original Steins Gate, and after 23 episodes of sheer hype material, we get 18 episodes of effectively nothing. The problem is that Steins Gate 0 is so poorly paced that it ruins the whole darkest world line concept. The show starts off great with around 6 episodes of build up before things really got going. The series then pulled the same hostage situation twist as episode 12 from the original, which would normally be a pretty bad twist. However, it was executed perfectly, making it a genuinely surprising and good twist. At this point, I made my theory video claiming that the girl in the biker suit was Makise Kurisu from another world line, since from a narrative perspective, the absolute greatest twist would have been for Okabe to be fighting the one person he wanted to save most of all, and from a lore perspective, this would have worked perfectly, since we know from season 1 episode 15 at timecode 355 that future Makise Kurisu from the Alpha world line is a traitor working with CERN.
Once CERN builds a time machine, they're the ones who are calling all the shots. With that kind of power at their disposal, it doesn't take long for them to decide the world needs to bend to their liking, for our own good, of course. And one person did more than anyone else to bring CERN's machine to fruition. The mother of time travel, they call her. Makise Kurisu.
Are you saying I'm some kind of traitor? I would never help them. I don't know where you got your information, but it's obviously wrong.
Well, it's true in 2036.
Looking back, there were some issues in regards to the canon with my theory. However, the twist they went with broke canon anyways, meaning if you're gonna break canon, at least go with a good twist. Here's where we really run into problems with pacing though. With the original Steins Gate, they took 12 episodes for things to really get going, but after episode 12, it was basically all plot and no build-up. On top of that, the story was incredibly dark, yet in spite of this, they claimed that the world line that we see in Steins Gate 0 is the darkest one. Now, why is it that after basically 25 episodes of build-up thanks to the original, Steins Gate 0 feels the need to have an additional 14 episodes of basically nothing happening in the supposed darkest world line? In the original, we could see Okabe desperately trying to save the life of the one person he could truly call his family before ultimately needing to make a choice between his one true family and his one and only love. And while yes, his parents are alive, we never actually see them in the show, leading me to believe that they're not as big a part of his life as Mayushi, who has been with him since the start of Steins Gate and who he has been desperately trying to save for the entirety of the original Steins Gate. I mean, I get it, he has PTSD, but please explain to me how having PTSD justifies calling this the darkest world line over what we saw in season 1, where he had to endlessly witness his loved ones die over and over again. They should have done all their build-up initially, just like they did in the original, and then just have the plot get going. By splitting the build-up between episodes 1 through 6, and then again through episodes 10 through 17, it destroyed the pacing of the show. Now let's address the end of episode 17. At the end of episode 17, they pulled one of the worst twists in the entire series. I say one of because there are multiple twists in episode 18 that are worse. At the end of episode 17, Mayuri gets shot and the show tries to trick the viewer into thinking she died. The reason this is such a garbage twist is because anyone actually paying attention to the plot would know that Mayuri simply can't die. Firstly, in terms of the anime, in the beginning of episode 1, we see Mayuri in the future, and it's implied that this is right before Suzuha and Kagari leave for the past. According to Steins Gate Season 1, Episode 2, at time code 1207, the grandfather paradox does not exist, meaning that in theory, anyone could die, but would simply change the world line. Since the world line didn't change, it means Mayuri didn't die.
Aren't you worried that by being here, you run the risk of creating a paradox?
The so-called grandfather paradox. It doesn't exist. It's possible to meet your past self. You'll simply change world lines if you do. Let's say, for example, someone murdered you. By traveling back in time to prevent it, I create two divergent worlds. One where you're killed, one where you're not. The same basic idea is true of all such actions. The traveler splits off to a different world line.
This twist is even worse with the context of the visual novel, since according to the visual novel, a person's death is usually predetermined and it's almost impossible to avoid. What can be avoided and what can be changed is the circumstances around the death. This is why no matter what Okabe did, Mayuri would die no matter what, but the way she died would change each time. Also, in case you're curious, in the visual novel, Okabe actually went to the police so that way they could guard her from the Rounders. However, she still died of a heart attack, meaning that even if her death could be physically avoided, she will still die no matter what. Why is this important? Since we see Mayuri alive in the future, that means that she dies later on in the future. It means her death is not determined yet, at least not in this period of time. Her death is going to happen sometime after the events of Steins Gate Zero. That basically means that it is impossible for her to die in Steins Gate Zero. Now this leads to one of two possibilities. It either lets the viewer believe that she's dead and they broke canon, or it leads us to believe that she's alive and that they're just baiting her. Either case, it's a horrible twist. Episode 18 is where things get much worse. First off, it's revealed that the one guy that everybody suspected from the start was actually the bad guy. Now, please explain to me how this is a twist. I mean, it could be argued that this is the greatest twist of all time, since if you look at it from the perspective that's such a bad twist that nobody would actually expect it, then it makes it a great twist. No one would expect them to pull the most obvious things in the world, Steins Gate of all series, to pull the obvious twist, but that would be such a moronic argument on so many levels. On top of that, his reason for doing so was generic, to say the least. Basically, he is a real quote-unquote mad scientist.
Hey master, I am mad scientist. It's so cool, son of a bitch.
Which is meant to be a reflection of how Okabe was prior to the events of the original Steins Gate, which is fine, but it's nothing special. I'm not going to complain about how generic the villain was, but I will complain about basically everything else. First off, when Okabe realized the obvious Professor Villain guy was the obvious villain the whole time, all he did is throw the guy down the stairs, and he didn't even finish the job! For crying out loud, the fate of the world is at stake. You can at least make sure the guy is out cold. Not only that, he didn't even take the gun away. What he should have done is he should have thrown the guy down another flight of stairs, or at least punched the guy in the face to make sure he's out cold. Again, the fate of the world is at stake. Instead, he leaves the gun on the floor right next to the guy, and of course it bites him in the butt 2 minutes later. Then as soon as he gets back up and threatens Okabe, he goes on and on about wanting to create a time paradox. As soon as he said this, I immediately slapped myself in the face. This spits in the face of Steins Gate lore. As mentioned earlier, they literally said in episode 2 that the grandfather paradox is impossible. While that doesn't rule out any other possible paradoxes, they haven't brought up a single other paradox at any point in the entire series. In episode 1 of Steins Gate Zero, Suzuha brought up the idea of a time paradox, and frankly, I just ignored it since it blatantly went against existing canon. However, in episode 18, even Okabe said that this guy was gonna create a paradox when he, of all people, should know that that's impossible. After this, a helicopter shows up and tries to kill everyone and destroy the time machine. However, it's so poorly executed that I have more questions than answers. Also, FYI, there might be legitimate answers to everything I'm about to bring up. However, it's the show's job to communicate those things to me so that way I understand it. The original Steins Gate did an amazing job with this, allowing you to understand why everything was happening, since the plot was executed in such a way that made it easy to understand. I know some people are going to yell at me for this, but Steins Gate Zero does not do this in the slightest. It does everything in a cryptic way by comparison to the original, and while yes, it does everything in a way that makes sense, and there probably are answers to basically everything, it's way too cryptic compared to the original, where everything was laid out in a way to make it possible to understand everything. Now, first off, how in the world do the Americans and Russians know about the time machine on the roof? Well, yes, there were instances in previous episodes of both of them meddling in certain things. There's no reason for the Russians specifically to know where it is. The Americans had Kaguri, because Professor Leskinen sent Kaguri back in time in order to tell his past self about the time machine. So I could believe that the Americans would know about it. But I have a hard time believing that he would tell the Russians when they're fighting over the time machine. So how in the world would they know about it? Even if there is a reason, the fact that I don't know means that either I'm a complete moron or the show just didn't communicate properly. And while I am in fact a moron, I have been following the show very well and I've watched each episode twice so far, subbed and dubbed. I still don't understand how the Russians knew about the time machine. Then there's the matter of how the Russians and Americans were able to get entire armies into Japan so quickly. There are so many logistical issues with this that it's downright moronic. First, there's the fact that the United States and Russia are effectively starting a war with Japan unprovoked and literally overnight. That would mean that in the span of one day, the US and Russia would somehow need to move all the troops, supplies, soldiers, etc. in place for the operation any more than a day, and we would have seen some indication that Japan is preparing for war to defend itself, since if you see the American army at your door, you bring a shotgun. Then there's the fact that the Americans and Russians would need to convince their soldiers that this war is justified and that the death of millions is justified without even telling them about the time machine, since doing so would risk the possibility that a soldier or two would go rogue and steal it for themselves. Then there's the fact that no nukes have been dropped. I'm sorry, but even if this is a proxy war between the US and Russia, there is no way that a proxy war of this scale would not include nukes. Even if I don't have all my facts straight, which is entirely possible, the original Steins Gate told its story in such a way to make it easy to understand, while Steins Gate Zero simply does not. Lastly, there was the end of the episode. Oh god, the end of the episode. The end of the episode was incredibly confusing, since basically nothing happened. I think I was supposed to cry, but why would I? They literally just pulled this shtick in the last episode. Now apparently Mayushi and Suzuha are quote-unquote dead, even though Mayushi can't die. So basically there's two possibilities. Either they killed her and decided to just spit in the face of Steins Gate canon, where they realize they can't actually kill her, so they decide to just quote-unquote kill her without actually killing her, which will probably lead to a horrible twist where they quote-unquote bring her back to life. If they didn't literally just pull this shtick in the last episode, I think I'd be a bit more accepting of it, but they've already demonstrated a complete lack of care for existing canon, so why should I care? Lastly, Okabe got a message from Mayuri after she quote-unquote died, which was clearly meant as a tear-jerking moment, but the entire time I just had my hand over my face in awe of how dumb this was. Aside from the issues laid out earlier of this being a horrible twist, why is it that now and only now is he receiving this message? Now, I watched a few videos on the topic, and apparently it's because the cell towers went down 2 episodes ago, and this is supposed to, because now it came back up, this is supposed to also hint towards the fact that the professor's assistant was actually the biker girl the entire time. And my reaction to this was, what? Here's the problem with this. This is a plot advancing scene, and you need background elements to explain it? In the original Steins Gate, after Okabe undid the first D-mail, he found out that it delayed Mayuri's death by 3 days. The reason it delayed it by 3 days each time is because of the butterfly effect. And while it's easier to understand in the visual novel, it's not necessary to understand why it delays it by 3 days each time, just the fact that it does. Basically, there are different reasons in the actual story why it specifically takes 3 days each and every time, and why it pushes it off by 3 days each and every time he does a D-mail. And while the show does communicate it in the original, it's a subtle background detail that you're supposed to pick up on after watching the series a few times. This is something different. In this case, in Steins Gate 0, this is a plot advancing scene. This is not something you're supposed to pick up on in the background. What they did here would be like if the original Steins Gate tried telling its story without explaining that erasing each D-mail delayed Mayuri's death by 3 days. Steins Gate 0 didn't need to explain how Okabe got the message, but it did need to explain why he got it now. The episode basically ended there, and it implied that World War III just started. Now, as mentioned earlier, there are so many problems with this episode. Like, I literally just, now I'm going off script, but this was the worst episode of any show I've ever seen in my entire life, and I could recognize that a lot of this is probably down to the adaptation. A lot of this is probably better explained in the visual novel, but I'm not playing the visual novel, am I? I'm watching the anime. I have a very similar problem with SAO. The light novel for SAO is actually really good. The problem is that everything other than that with SAO, that the A1 basically butchered the adaptation. Now, it's the same thing here. Everyone's complaining about the animation, just like with Andromeda, everyone complaining about the animation with both. But the issue is not the animation, the issue is the story. Like, really? Why? Why? How do you mess it up this bad? There are so many problems here. There are certain core problems that are issues with the story as a whole. As I mentioned earlier, the problems that Leskinen is the bad guy all alone. It would actually be a better twist to find out that he's not the bad guy and that he's just as surprised as Okabe and that he wants to help Okabe. That would legitimately surprise me, and that would actually be kind of interesting in my opinion. To find out that he's the bad guy is the most generic twist possible. Now, again, there's that issue that's a problem with the story as a whole. Then there's the issues again with the core structure of the series as a whole in the anime adaptation, that they decided to split up the thing by having the first 6 episodes of build up and then episodes 10 through 17 is build up. It completely removes all sense of pacing. And then there's all those other issues I mentioned, like the whole thing of the Russian and American armies and all that, which are probably explained in the visual novel better and probably is explained in a way that makes sense, but it's not explained well in the anime. Maybe it's not even explained in the visual novel. I have no idea. I've seen like the first hour or so of the visual novel, so I have no idea. What I do know is that the visual novel had a lot more detail for the 1 hour I did see of it, so I wouldn't be surprised if those problems weren't in the visual novel. So, yeah. basically, I'm dropping this show and I'm not picking it back up anytime soon. Maybe in a few years, maybe when I calm down a bit, I have no idea, but there's no way that I'm picking up this pile of garbage anytime soon. So, yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that.